Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to explore one of the hottest and most important topics in national security: air and missile defense of the homeland. President Trump highlighted this in a big way with the launch of his Golden Dome program, but the reality is that the need for an improved set of homeland defense capabilities has been brewing for a long time. Whether we're looking at the news from the war between Russia and Ukraine, Israel under attack by Iran, or vessels bombarded by drones and missiles in the Red Sea, it's clear that we're facing a new era of threats. This is a back-to-the-future moment in many ways because the United States had to get real about air and missile defense in a big way during the opening years of the Cold War. Air Defense Command, ADC, and NORAD, North American Air Defense, were some of the biggest investment areas for the nation. A nuclear-armed, long-range, strike-equipped Soviet Union was no joke. The threat really was existential, and leaders acted accordingly. Today, we're seeing a new range of threat dynamics cause extreme concern. We talk about it all the time here on Aerospace Advantage. China and Russia are on the rise, and they're pushing aggressively around the globe. They have the means, and they've demonstrated their intent. Countries like Iran and North Korea also pose risks. And added to that, there are proxies and non-state actors that can project offensive power into our homeland. So with that, we've assembled two of our nation's most senior experts to help explain what's at stake and why we need to take action. First and foremost, we have General Glen VanHerck. Sir, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's great to be with you, Heather, and it's great to be with General Chilton, a great friend and mentor.
Thank you. General VanHerck is former commander of NORTHCOM, the combatant command charged with the Homeland Defense Mission, and the North American Aerospace Defense Command. Sir, thanks again. And we've also got General Kevin Chilton, Chili.
Great to join you, Heather, as ever. And Glenn, great to see you in retirement now.
Sir, it's always wonderful to have you here. And for the listeners who haven't been with Chili before, he served as a commander of STRATCOM, and he now holds the Explorer Chair at the Mitchell Institute. So, General VanHerck, let's kick things off with you. You were responsible for the nation's homeland defense and the defense of North America. So, did I lay things out accurately in the opener? And how do you see the air and missile threat facing North America and the homeland today?
Well, Heather, I think you certainly laid things out correctly. But I would say as I look at the environment, it even expands beyond where you laid it out today. Certainly, we have threats from seabed to space and all domains in between, including the information space. You're specifically focusing on the air and missile domains or threats. What I would like to talk about is a little bit different today, and I think General Chilton would agree that, in the past, we focused on the Soviet Union. That threat has grown beyond the Soviet Union to Russia, a nuclear threat, and clearly was the existential threat. China, as an individual threat, now partnering with Russia, along with North Korea and Iran and other authoritarian regimes around the globe, all with the intent to hold us at risk here in our homeland, delay and disrupt force flow, and destroy the will of the people. The threats are vastly different. I'll point at the existential threat for Russia, which has been there for decades, but now China is greatly expanding their nuclear capability beyond a few hundred into the thousands, just as Russia has had for decades. That creates some really unique challenges for us here in the homeland, both from a deterrence and a defense perspective. North Korea is going to gain a lot from their support to Russia in Ukraine: missile technology, satellite technology, cyber, certainly nuclear and ICBM capabilities. Those are vastly different than the past. And with Iran providing drones to Ukraine, I'm certain that Iran's going to get capabilities. And these are all going to be challenges for us here in the homeland. I'll just add one more thing and try not to be too long-winded here, but when I talked about all domains, the threats today can emanate from space. And so we saw the fractional orbital bombardment system. Call that a missile threat, call it a space threat, what you want, but it erodes strategic stability and increases the risk of strategic deterrence failure. Also today, the threats they're blurring the lines between conventional threats to our homeland and nuclear, which increases the risk of deterrence failure as well if you can't detect the difference of which of those threats it may be. So certainly it's the same, and you elaborated on that, but I would say it's expanded well beyond where we were a few decades ago.
Sir, I think you outlaid that perfectly because, as you mentioned, it's not just a single threat that we have today. It's not just the Soviet Union. It is a multiple threat. So we've got China, Russia together. China's having that nuclear breakout. They're partnering with North Korea. They're partnering with Iran and other authoritarian regimes to complicate our problem set with a variety of different types of threats, not just bombers and not just ICBMs. You mentioned the FOBs as well. General Chilton, you've also thought a lot about Homeland Defense given your role at STRATCOM. And we had General VanHerck just mention deterrence. Credible, effective deterrence based on our nuclear triad stands as an enduring foundational defense imperative. And we mentioned China's nuclear breakout. Russia is also modernizing their nuclear arsenals. And again, also General VanHerck mentioned that North Korea has a set of capabilities and Iran is pursuing theirs. How does this affect our calculus?
I think General VanHerck laid it out very well, the increase in the threat, and you've highlighted as well, Heather. What strikes me about this is that it's a dramatic change in the threat basis toward the United States of America. And this rapid increase, particularly in China and the expansion into North Korea of their capability and the sustained belligerence of Russia suggests to me that we have to change. We have to do something different. In the Cold War, we relied not only on our offensive strike capability to deter, but we had a very robust defensive capability for the homeland. I recall right across the street from my high school in Los Angeles, which bordered the Los Angeles International Airport, was a Nike missile battery when I was in grammar school and high school. There were Nike missile batteries on the Palos Verdes Peninsula. There's some on top of the Malibu Mountains. And General VanHerck can go on, I'm sure, on and on about how many fighters we had in defending the borders of the United States, the DEW line across Canada, et cetera, et cetera. We believe that to adequately deter our adversaries not only included an offensive strike capability to retaliate, threaten retaliation, but also it required and bolstered deterrence to have a defensive capability. And we walked away from that completely at the end of the Cold War. And I think these new threats that we're seeing are going to demand that we make adjustments both in our offensive capability, but also to begin to reconstitute some of our defensive capabilities that we had in the Cold War, because they do indeed enhance deterrence and put doubt in an adversary's mind and their ability to successfully strike the United States in a limited or large fashion. The world has changed, and we need to wake up to that and be willing to make the investments necessary to adjust our posture.
So I really appreciate how you emphasize the need to defend as part of deterrence, because that your ability to be able to defeat an adversary's attack really affects their risk calculus. When they're doing their decisions of, are we going to create an attack on the United States, on the homeland, especially if it's a nuclear attack, if they're not going to achieve their objectives and they also risk being retaliated against, I think that has an incredible impact on deterrence. And, you know, as you said, we took a break from thinking about homeland defense after the end of the Soviet Union. And not only did we completely do away with Air Defense Command and we stood down all of those units, we also cut the Air Force completely in half so that offensive capability went away. We are too slow in getting Sentinel, the ground-based strategic deterrence, up and running. But we've also, I think, lost the intellectual capital when it comes to understanding deterrence, especially nuclear deterrence combined with conventional deterrence. So this question is for both of you about the interplay between nuclear and non-nuclear threats facing our homeland. Are they two separate issues, two separate entities, or do you see those threats as being integrated? I mean, understanding the weapons themselves, right? China has both conventional and nuclear. Russia has both conventional and nuclear. But how do you see those nations integrating those capabilities when they're in this new world?
Well, I'll begin. And oftentimes we focus, I think, a little too much on nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. We say conventional, we think conventional TNT explosives.
Yeah.
Um,
Non-radiological.
yeah. But there's another weapon out there today, too, that we didn't have to deal with in the 90s, that we have to deal with every day now, and that's the cyber threat. And there's also the threat to our space assets, which can be done with non-explosive means to take them out, whether it be directed energy jamming or kinetic effects. And so it was interesting in the nuclear posture review under the Bush administration, recognizing that there's more than just nuclear threats to the homeland that could have significant impact on the homeland. We changed the wording in the nuclear posture review to say that one of the principal reasons for having our nuclear deterrent was to defend against strategic attack on the homeland, not just nuclear attack. And so strategic attack broadens the idea that we get to determine what's strategic. And a massive cyber attack can be strategic. A conventional attack targeted strategic resources, such as nuclear weapon storage areas or national labs, et cetera, with an attempt to make us unable to support our nuclear deterrent, could also be considered strategic. So I think we have to broaden as that document did, broaden our understanding and make sure our adversaries understand that we don't have this deterrent just to deter against nuclear attack anymore. And we have to be paying attention to these other threats. And we don't always want to put the president in the position to have to respond with a nuclear weapon to a strategic attack. So we need to be thinking about how we might respond in the cyber domain, how we might respond conventionally to achieve strategic objectives, how we might want to respond in the space domain.
Sir, I really like how you flip the script there with strategic attack, because in the past, I think we've reduced strategic attack or strategic forces, and we've used that really as a synonym for nuclear. But in this case, you're really talking about the consequences. If we had, there's a cyber attack against SCADA systems, all the electricity goes out. Cyber attack against our water systems, a conventional attack or a terrorist attack, as you mentioned, against our nuclear forces, that strategic effect would then demand a response. And I also really appreciate the notion of providing the president alternatives that are not always just nuclear responses. General VanHerck, what's your thought on this?
I think General Chilton did a great job laying it out. To answer your question directly, I think the answer is yes and no. So do you think about them separately? Yeah, they're vastly different weapons, nuclear versus conventional. And the power, the destruction of nuclear has to be given consideration. But as senior leaders, we can't bifurcate nuclear and conventional deterrence or activities. I think we owe it to the National Command Authority to talk across a range of options and risk and that spectrum before you start down a path in an escalation ladder with any country with nuclear weapons or a country with an umbrella from a country with nuclear weapons. We need to have a discussion about the risk of strategic deterrence failure in an attack on our homeland across a spectrum of weapons, not just one or the other. And you can't step on that ladder without having that discussion. It's not like you can wait till halfway into a conflict and start thinking about nuclear deterrence and activities. That should be a daily discussion overall. I think General Chilton did a fantastic job laying it out. I want to just convey one more thing about deterrence, and we were talking about deterrence by denial with our ability to defeat, and that questions their success. But I think also in deterrence by denial, especially in our homeland, is our ability to withstand that attack, not just defeat it, through resilience, through the ability to ensure command and control, survival from cyber capability, defense, and resilience, to take a punch in the nose, as I said last week, and get up and be able to swing. And this creates doubt in any potential adversary's mind about being successful, and that is strategic deterrence.
I really appreciate how you laid that out. Take a punch in the nose and get back up swinging is perfect. And both of you had mentioned that our adversaries are now contesting the space domain, right? So let's broaden this out from, we've talked about the terrestrial, we've talked about the homeland, but the space domain. Adversaries they've got weapons up there. I mean, we talked about China testing FOB's fractional orbital bombardment system, dropping weapons from space onto the Earth. This kind of stuff isn't what we wanted to happen, but our adversaries' actions, they've taken the initiative, now demand that we respond. And what does this mean from an air and missile perspective? What does that mean for how we should begin to plan, not only, again, about survivability, resilience, and defeat, but we can't just simply allow our adversaries to give them and cede to them space as a weaponized domain?
Well, I'll defer to General Chilton as a space expert, but I'll let him go first. Let me just say a couple things.
Yeah, please do.
So absolutely space is contested, but there's much more ongoing in space today than fractional orbital bombardment systems and potential attacks on our homeland, terrestrial attacks.
Space to space, right?
Yeah, so space, the most strategic mission I did as the NORAD commander in my mind was threat warning and attack assessment. That was to enable and assure continuity of government, survival of nuclear forces, and the nuclear command and control and force posture. That is largely driven by space. Attacks on that space infrastructure that poke our eyes out to be able to have that threat warning and attack assessment is, a significant strategic event that erodes strategic stability. Much of our nuclear command and control architecture is space-based architecture. And the ability to have that survive, the ability to detect attacks on that is crucial for surviving forces in the homeland, continuity of government, et cetera. There's much more. So I think deterrence overall has to factor into their decision calculus, whether that's an attack in space on space assets, supporting terrain-based capabilities, or space-based weapons and threats attacking terrestrially, whether they're conventional or nuclear. And we need to create enough deterrence and resilience from both the space architecture and the terrain that we defend and the architecture and critical infrastructure to create a doubt in their mind about being able to achieve their objectives. And if they did attack, fearing the punishment that they know will come back because we're so resilient.
Thank you, sir. General Chilton, how would you add to this?
Heather, I couldn't add much more to that at all. And space is absolutely essential to our deterrence posture, particularly our nuclear command and control capability, which is a broad statement that includes both missile warning, the ability to communicate with our strategic forces, our radar systems that are ground-based today and may in the future be space-based. These are all absolutely essential elements of our deterrence posture. And I think General VanHerck laid it out exactly as it should be discussed. Now, you brought up FOBs. FOBs, first of all, in the space treaty, there's only one treaty that's been signed about space, and in it says we're not going to put nuclear weapons in space. That's about the only extent of it, or on another planet. And so both the Soviets and the United States agreed not to do that during the Cold War.
But that was just the Soviets and the United States, right?
Right, that's correct. And China's threat to do this requires a response. And we need to be in a position to know when they put one in orbit. And then we need, through space superiority, be able to hold that thing at risk and certainly be able to track it and be able to warn and defend against it should they execute it. And so this is a new wrinkle because that type of capability and our current posture could be an unwarned attack. And we don't want that. We want to be able to make sure we understand the risk and have the time and capabilities to make decisions to defend against it. So it's a very dangerous weapon and a very dangerous approach. But there are things that can be done to address it. They have not deployed one yet, but we need to consider what posture we would want to be in, what capabilities we want to have to defend should they do that.
PenFed checking and savings accounts are here for all your adventures. From
do you take this man to be your husband?
I do.
To
he has your eyes. He's perfect.
Learn more at PenFed.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
And sir, I'm just going to take this moment and make a plug for the Space Force, because the Space Force has not received the budget and the resourcing that they need to be able to execute the incredible growing number of mission sets that they need to be able to do a lot of the responsibilities that we require of them, whether or not that is the missile warning, whether or not that's defensive capabilities, what you're talking about, being able to actively defend space from space, or maybe even prevent Chinese from using the fractional orbital bombardment system. But I really appreciate, General VanHerck, how you mentioned that one of the most important missions that you executed was that missile warning, being able to detect launches, characterize them, understand them, because without that ability, it's ultimately very destabilizing.
I love what you were saying about if you don't have the warning, I mean, because
really
it's been taken away
destabilizes.
from you, very
Yeah.
destabilizing. And the warning means you've got to have the situational awareness, what's going on. And where I would want to take this discussion, and Glenn, I kind of defer to you on this, but I'll give you a quick anecdote. One of my first exercises at STRATCOM, the scenario had a couple of Bear bombers take off and head toward the ADIZ over the north. And they got within cruise missile range of the continental United States and turned around and went back home, or turned around and started going back away. I turned to my two and said, did they launch a cruise missile? And the answer was, we don't know. I said, when will we know? And they said, when the time of flight it ends up, whether it detonates or not, because we had no way to detect a launch or track the missiles across Canada toward the United States. And I think we're so focused on the space part of Golden Dome today. There's another part of it, which is the airside defense that we dismantled after the Cold War. And so, Glenn, is that something that would make sense to talk about here?
Yeah, certainly that would make sense. What I could expand this to is the need to adapt our tactics, techniques, and procedures in the homeland to, rather than having fixed sites that are there 24/7, is the need to have the ability to rapidly deploy, move based on policy designating specific critical infrastructure, whether those be air assets, surface to air assets, naval assets with capabilities, and keep any potential adversary questioning their targeting success. Now, if they go with nuclear weapons, that's a different story, but certainly on a conventional basis, that would factor into the deterrence equation if they don't know where the deterrence by denial assets are. But I do agree with your comment, and it still exists today, that, if we don't have domain awareness, you still have very limited capability to do anything against the threat attacking the homeland from a cruise missile or hypersonic. Heather, you didn't talk about hypersonics and their destabilizing capability, because we do not have the ability to provide the threat warning and attack assessment fidelity we do for ballistic missiles. That's another aspect we could go down, and I'll pause there.
No, I think this is a great conversation. I think we should also continue down it because, General Chilton, as you mentioned, not every square inch of the Earth is covered 24/7 by satellite, and especially around the poles. And we've recently completed a report on Arctic domain awareness, which is the shortest path from them to us, how we just don't have those sensors anymore. And so, General VanHerck, what you mentioned about having the flexibility to be able to move assets, both those sensors and the responders, and surge those forces where necessary, I think is really important as well. Because when the public hears the word Golden Dome, they think that it's a missile shield that goes from sea to shining sea and from north to south, and anything that begins to trespass that bubble just instantaneously vaporizes. And I just don't think that's realistically something that's technologically feasible and certainly wouldn't be affordable. So we need to think about how do we protect the critical infrastructure, do so on a surge capacity, but all of this requires a domain awareness and the ability to anticipate and execute. So we still have this major gap, sir, as you mentioned, regarding hypersonics, those kinds of cruise missiles. How do we solve for that problem?
I think Golden Dome has to look at not only the effectors, kinetic, whether it be laser-based in space, but also it has to provide the threat warning and attack assessment capability necessary to make the strategic decisions that are going to be need to make in a time of crisis or conflict. And that starts with that domain awareness you talked about. Today, we're challenged from hypersonics being able to provide that domain awareness. The space-based architecture that the Space Force is working on should narrow that gap that we have today to give us that, but that's not a sole option to help us with cruise missiles, for example, where there's significant gaps, especially in terrain to the south, the east, and the west. So I do think there's some work to be done, but all of these need to be stitched together. You can't look at space domain awareness, terrestrial domain awareness, and geographically separate. They all need to be fused with a data layer, as well as, I think, Golden Dome. And that way, this common data layer, the C2 centers can pull down the data they need to make their decisions, whether those are domain awareness and continuity decisions, or those are effector decisions, whether it's a space-based effector, a terrain, a terrestrial, a naval vessel, et cetera.
So that really becomes a thorny problem set that I think, as you mentioned, having that data layer that gives you that fused common situational awareness to allow commanders, whether or not that's you at NORTHCOM or elevating that up to the National Command Authority, to be able to respond appropriately. And you mentioned a little bit about the policy piece, so I'd like to do a quick little pivot and discuss that, because Glen VanHerck, you commanded both NORAD and NORTHCOM. Can you talk to us about what those commands entailed and the interplay between the two? So how do they function together to provide that defense for the continent?
Yeah, Heather, so great question. Two separate commands, two separate chains of command, if you will, but I like to say they're inseparable. And I can give you examples by that. So, for example, in my NORAD hat, as I said, the strategic mission we did of threat warning and attack assessment for continuity of government for North America and also for survival of forces would apply to all of North America. With that said, if it was a threat, I would put on my NORTHCOM hat if it was a ballistic missile and utilize ballistic missile capabilities to render an effect against potential threat. If it's a cruise missile, I would keep my NORAD hat on and go after it with airborne assets. And if I was giving surface assets, then the question becomes, are we going to give those surface-to-air assets to me in a NORAD or NORTHCOM hat? Let me give you another example why they're separate but inseparable. The missions of NORAD were aerospace warning, aerospace control, and maritime warning. And so I would be tracking out-of-area submarines on a routine basis globally, but as certainly they entered the NORTHCOM and NORAD AORs and regions, and provide maritime warning for that to the government of Canada, to the government of the United States. If I was going to prosecute that submarine, though, I would do that with my NORTHCOM hat on through Maritime Homeland Defense. If that submarine launched a ballistic missile, I would put my NORTHCOM hat on to go after it with the ballistic missile systems that we have. But if it launched a cruise missile, I would likely put my NORAD hat back on and go after that cruise missile with the air assets that we had or the integrated air and missile defense system that we had in the National Capital Region. So those examples should convey it. Separate but inseparable commands.
No, you've got me fully convinced there. But what's the difference when you're talking about NORAD or NORTHCOM? How do you factor in allied contributions? I mean, are they also part of that separate but inseparable element of both NORAD and NORTHCOM, or just one but not the other?
Well, today, Canada provides assets in their NORAD terms of reference and agreement to the NORAD mission. Yeah. And they funded 40% historically of the NORAD mission to include the North Warning System and much more. They had made a policy decision not to be involved with ballistic missile defense. And so on the ballistic missile side, that has been funded solely by the Department of Defense, now changing to the Department of War, and under the NORTHCOM hat. Canada is reconsidering that policy and has expressed interest under Golden Dome, the auspices, of getting more involved, including the ballistic missile and hypersonic defense. So we'll see where that goes. They have continued to fund and provide great funding. The relationship, by the way, the military relationship is exceptional, despite some of the stresses we've seen in recent years. And I would articulate to you that defending our own soil and our own homeland would be a much greater risk and challenge without Canada, without access to the regions that Canada holds in the Arctic, where we have domain awareness sensors and much more.
As you said, separate but inseparable, and the contributions that Canada provides is crucial to defending the American homeland as well. General Chilton, bringing you back into the conversation with STRATCOM, because when you commanded, it included the nuclear deterrence mission as well as space, but those were now split. So you've got STRATCOM and Space Command. So could you talk to us about the responsibilities and how they fit into the Homeland Defense equation?
They're mutually interdependent. And certainly, I think our greatest dependence is on space. And we talked about that earlier. And we, for too many years, did not treat space as a domain where warfare or battle could possibly take place. And now it clearly is a domain where it not only can take place, our adversaries will likely go there and wage war against our assets in space because they realize our dependency on them, which emphasizes the point that, as in any other domain, the United States of America needs to be able to gain and maintain superiority in the space domain. And as you pointed out earlier, Heather, that's going to call for increased manpower, increased technology, increased funding across the spectrum that you'd see in any other domain, whether it be in training, acquisition of capabilities, exercise testing, flexing your muscle, and actually having true capabilities that not only are based in space, but can affect adversary space capabilities and defend ours from the other domains, air, land, and sea. So we have a big hill to climb there to be in a position where we convince our adversaries that this is not a good idea to attack us in space, and be in a position to deter that type of attack. It's essential that we move out in that direction.
No, I think when it comes to Space Command, because there are so many dependencies that we have on space assets, that as we begin to move forward, we'll need to develop not just the capabilities, but also the tactics, techniques, and procedures to provide terrestrial support to space to ensure that those assets are available, so that whether it's STRATCOM, NORAD, or NORTHCOM, that we have those space assets available. So, General VanHerck, back to NORAD NORTHCOM. You were the commander for the notorious Chinese balloon incident, and you were also in the seat for the Langley drone incident. So what did those experiences teach us about our organizational structures, capabilities, and the overarching homeland defense?
Yeah, so great question. The first thing I would tell you is the challenges we face today are global and all domain. And the lines that we've placed on a map that create geographic combatant commands and the stovepipes we have functionally are gaps and seams that create vulnerabilities for us. So we have to think globally, and relationships have never mattered more than they do today, to be able to pick up the phone across not only DoD with fellow combatant commanders, because Homeland Defense does not start in the homeland. It starts forward, fellow combatant commanders and allies and partners. So I think that's critical. The ability to pick up the phone, or somebody pick up the phone and call me and tell me, here comes a spy balloon, certainly less than 24 hours ahead would have been much appreciated. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And Homeland Defense is not only DoD. It's Department of Homeland Security. It's our neighbors to the north. It's our neighbors to the south. And those relationships matter. But an interagency look and the relationships across, whether it be Homeland Security, FEMA, transportation, energy, to create the resiliency that we need to defend our homeland are critical. Now, I think we're lacking policy significantly on what to defend from who and what capacity. When I think about Golden Dome, Heather, There's a challenge on going after 4,000 ballistic missiles. I don't think it's affordable and achievable. So what is the right number to actually create that deterrence by denial effect that we need without going beyond and potentially, as some people would say, creating a stability challenge by having too much capability and capacity. So that's something that we can talk about later on as well. But if you don't know what to defend from what threats and how much, then it's hard to budget and plan for that. I found this on the Langley drone incident, is we really don't have an overarching governance and strategy for how to deal with the UAS threat or even the drone threat in our homeland. That's being worked. But policy is a challenge, both for Golden Dome and the counter UAS threat. And then once you know the policy, you got to develop capabilities within the ability to operate in our homeland. So I can tell you the Department of Transportation and FAA won't be appreciative of us firing missiles and capabilities around that create safety challenges. Those are, again, policy decisions. So what capabilities can you operate in our homeland? Who has the authority to do that? And that forces us down a different effector line than most overseas engagements would be. So let's go back to policy. There will be some critical infrastructure that will be so important that we're going to risk the safety of our citizens to go after it because it's an existential threat to our nation. But it's not all, and we should have those discussions, and we should have them with a sense of urgency. We're not moving fast enough. Well, let me add one more thing to that. I think that Homeland Defense is a whole of nation, not a whole of government, a whole of nation challenge for us, especially the UAS threat. And I expect to see that some commercial entities within the defense industrial base, the energy sector, transportation, and beyond will likely be defending themselves, not relying on DoD or DHS, but they're going to have to reach out, just like they do in the cyber domain today. They're probably going to have to be able to defend themselves. And then, again, that's a policy decision of what that looks like for our government.
Can I add a couple of thoughts here?
Yes, you bet.
So drones are one thing, and drones aren't going to fly over here from the Soviet Union or the Russia or China.
No, they're going to be launched locally, right? Yeah.
Okay, so that's an internal problem. And none of the points that were brought up were incorrect with regard to how you think about those. But I'm going to bring the conversation a little bit back to threats from
Golden Dome.
Threats from China, threats from Russia and North Korea. I want to start with a discussion on stability and defense. First of all, as I said earlier, defense does help deter. I mean, that's why we have Patriot missiles, to deter adversary air to coming into a particular area. Are they going to be 100% effective? No. Do they work as a deterrent, and do they work to mitigate the results of an attack? Absolutely. And that's what we're talking about here in Golden Dome, is the ability to enhance deterrence and to mitigate effects. And it goes beyond that, I believe. I think, we have to ask ourselves, why is China building up so rapidly? Why did they go from feeling secure to have a guaranteed response where they were attacked and felt that was enough to deter, to suddenly they want to build a first strike capability with their nuclear arsenal? And I come to one conclusion, and that is there is no translation for the word deterrence into Chinese other than as the word coercion. They want to have a coercive posture in the world where they can deter us or coerce us not to engage in support of our allies in the Western Pacific and not to do other things that are important to our national interests. And we can't allow them to do that. And they know our center of gravity. It's our American populace. That's what we value. They don't value their people like we value our people. And I think we have a moral responsibility to defend, not 100%. I agree, it can't ever be done completely, but to defend enough to put doubt in their mind that they can coerce us to not meet our obligations, to not meet our responsibilities, to maintain freedom around the world. Because that's what they want to take away. They've said it. By 2050, they want to be the world's superpower, and they want to set the rules of the world order, disrupt everything that the United States and freedom-loving people have put in place since 1945. And they want to do that through coercion. And defense is part of that, to allow or to inhibit them from being able to coerce us. And I also want to touch on this notion of stability. First, I'm going to define it. Strategic stability. And another stability, arms race stability. First, strategic stability. I define that as a posture where neither side is tempted to strike first because they don't see it to their advantage. Either they can't stand the pain of doing that, or they don't think they'll be successful in whatever their objective is. And the best way to ruin strategic stability is to be weak, because then you invite a first strike. You invite the thought in the adversary's mind that perhaps they can succeed. Okay? So, fielding a missile defense system is not destabilizing, even if it's 100%. If you have 1,000 weapons and I have 1,000 weapons, and we're adversaries, and I put up 100 missile defense systems that are guaranteed to shoot down 100 of your missiles, are you going to attack me? No, because I still have 1,000 that can destroy you. If I put up 300 missiles, are you going to attack me? No, because I still have 1,000 that can destroy you. If I put up 1,000 missiles that can defeat your 1,000 offensive systems, are you going to attack me? No, it's suicide. So it is not destabilizing to have an effective missile defense system. It may lead to an arms race, but we get to decide whether or not we want to race. We don't have to. All we have to do is field a deterrent with offensive and defensive capabilities that we determine will be adequate to either strike fear in the heart of our adversaries over something they value, or create enough doubt in their mind that they will not believe that they could achieve their objective. I think we forget this. And so I don't like to hear, and this is a classic Russian argument in the arms talks. Oh, missile defense is destabilizing. It is not. And in fact, I would go as far as to say there's a moral obligation. If you have the technology to defend your populace, you should. The other question I think that's raised, and it was brought up about on the drone side, that I think is really important, is what do you want to defend? What is your critical infrastructure? Maybe the most important thing to defend is your ability to respond. So maybe it's your missile fields. Maybe it's your cities. Maybe it's your command and control capability. These are important discussions to have as Golden Dome was developed. And let's not forget our forward deployed forces. Okay, that's where we prefer to fight.
Thank you for bringing us back to the notion of defense and then talking about the strategic stability. You know, the other piece of it too is because you mentioned China is looking to be coercive and they are doing this breakout. It's not just simply so they can be coercive. If they can force us because we don't, if they can force us into a homeland defense holdback, then they have free reign across the entire Pacific. And we know that China has an active defense policy where they are willing to take a first strike, and they will view that as a defensive action, even if the United States has not taken any kind of offensive action against them. That active defense, in their mind, justifies us as a defensive capability, aggressively moving forward and taking that first strike.
Yeah, Heather, I want to weigh in just a second. I think
Please do.
we got a PhD level articulation from General Chilton, and I agree with everything he said.
Yes.
He alluded to this, and I think it's important that I'm going to emphasize it, is actually the inability to defend yourself, the inability to detect threats, the lack of resilience is actually destabilizing and invites a potential attack as well. And I think that's crucial. That's why we need to plug these gaps, whether that's a conventional attack, a cyber attack, or a nuclear attack. And I would argue that China believes that through cyber means they could delay and disrupt our force flow so that we have a fait accompli because we can't get to a fight in time. We have to prevent that from happening. That's the strategic stability other side of the argument. I would be interested to hear if General Chilton agrees with that.
No, I certainly do. Certainly do, Glenn.
Yeah, we need to be resilient enough that we can withstand those asymmetric kinds of attacks. Sir, you mentioned the cyber attacks on our electrical infrastructure and other critical subsystems, preventing us from being able to move. Yeah, that kind of weakness is something we also need to defend against, not just sort of in the traditional shot per shot, but ensuring that our infrastructure is able to withstand those attacks so we can continue to flow those forces forward.
Let me add one more thing,
Please.
Heather. When we talk about drones, I think it's important that we articulate what we're really talking about. I talk about UAS or small UAS is the DJI, the things you can
Little
buy.
quadcopters.
Today, we're seeing drones in Ukraine, Russia, that have the ability, should they be deployed in the Western Hemisphere, such as at Venezuela, to reach our homeland. Those are drones that a Golden Dome is going to have to account for in the Western Hemisphere and other places. And they can certainly reach our homeland from Eastern Russia into North America and likely portions of our homeland elsewhere. So we need to articulate clearly what threat we're talking about when we say the word drone.
I think you're absolutely correct, sir, because here at Mitchell, we've been talking about those kinds of drones, if you will, as really cruise missiles. They're autonomous, maneuverable cruise missiles. They might not look, taste, and smell like what we traditionally think a cruise missile looks like, but that's essentially what they are.
Yes, I agree with you 100%.
If you think back at the end of the Cold War, right? So the Soviet Union falls, the East Berlin Wall comes down, and it's the end of history. The nation cuts the Air Force in half, just decimates the Air Defense Command. So all those alert sites, all of that used to protect us, whether or not that was in response for deterrence or our offensive capabilities, just comes plummeting down. And today we struggle to field enough capacity to handle what the COCOMs are demanding abroad. I mean, much less being able to simultaneously address the homeland threat. So what we do right now is you've got a handful of jets and a handful of guys that come hold back and they sit alert and everyone else flows forward. But in an actual pure contest, in order to be able to protect the homeland, there's a homeland holdback. It almost becomes an either or scenario. Do you keep forces at home to be able to protect the homeland and respond? Or do you push those forces forward and leave the homeland uncovered?
And the biggest vulnerability, and we would talk about this years ago, is look, if you're going to actually put the bomber force on alert, you're going to put a bunch of tankers on alert. And if you're going to, and simultaneously, the reason you're doing that is because you're worrying about a threat to the homeland. NORAD NORTHCOM is going to need a bunch of tankers on alert. And oh, by the way, the fight's going to be happening on the other side of the Pacific. You're going to need a bunch of tankers because we have not built strike capability with any kind of substantial range at all that can move forward in the air domain without tankers. Kind of me, it's tankers.
No, that's an
But Glenn, I defer to you on a lot of this, but we had, and it got back to the point you made earlier about individual plans and not integrating them. The NORAD NORTHCOM had a plan about how many tankers they needed. STRATCOM had a plan about how many tankers they needed. And INDOPACOM's got a plan about how many tankers they needed.
And we only have enough tankers for maybe half of any of those plans.
Probably one.
Just a couple of thoughts on that. And General Chilton's right on. First of all, it starts with policy. Combatant commanders ask for what policy tells them to do. And I felt my job was to give a range of options and convey the risk across that spectrum of options over time. Maybe it's time you go look at policy, but if we're going to have policy that exceeds joint force capacity, then we need to figure out how to build a bigger joint force to achieve that. And that is going to be defense industrial base moving forward, et cetera. What we can't do is have combatant commanders not ask for what they need to achieve the policy, because now we're masking the risk to our nation's leaders. And so we've got to figure that out. But it starts with global plans, global resourcing, global risk, and where the secretary and our national command authority is willing to accept risk and where they're not. And then you apportion forces to plan for the force you have today, or else we'll find ourselves adjudicating forces in crisis and conflict and O plans that are no longer executable because that's what we're doing. We are starting to move in that path. We're just not moving fast enough, Heather.
Thank you, gentlemen. We've talked about the plans. We've talked about the resources. We've talked about deterrence. We've really covered, I think, a lot when it comes to considering What will it take to secure the homeland against the air and missile defense? What last thoughts would you like to leave with our listeners?
Well, I tell you what, I kind of like the way General VanHerck
Yeah.
put a ribbon around it here at the end. I mean, I thought that was a great summary, and we need to do the hard work to figure out what resourcing we need to achieve these objectives. And we need to move out quickly in this area because our adversaries.
Yeah, they're not waiting for us. Gentlemen, thank you so much. This has been an incredible conversation. We really appreciate you both making the time and appreciate your wisdom and perspective.
Thanks, Heather.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Glenn, great. I love that last piece. Super. Thanks, Heather.
And with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's conversation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button or follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on X, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great Aerospace Power kind of day. See you next time. Fantastic. Sir, you are quickly gaining a massive fan club here at the Mitchell Institute. We might be leaning on you a little bit more because your candor, your perspective, your insights, and your ability to clearly articulate them has just been refreshing and very valued. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if you're talking to me or Chili, but I think
No,
so.
I'm talking to you.
I was talking to you. Not that those isn't also true for Chili, but Chili already knows that he's got a firm fan club here too.
Yeah, I think he articulates the strategic nature of nuclear weapons, strategic stability better than anybody. And our capstone crowd and pinnacle crowd have been so fortunate and blessed to have him. If I was going to put a bow on it for people listening, what I would say is this is a whole nation problem. It's a global problem, and our asymmetric advantage is our network of allies and partners, and we have to work this together. There will be people that will say, we cannot afford this. I would say we can't afford to not do this, or else we change dramatically as a country. We begin to become manipulated from outside forces, and we can't allow that to happen. So I think this is the argument of we can't afford not to take action with a sense of urgency.
I agree with you. And I agree that the conversation we had about the internal threat and the external threat, our adversaries are really savvy. I think they're actually tied together. I think China would absolutely have embedded forces within the U.S. that would basically do a spider web type attack in addition to their cyber forces at the same time that they would be launching cruise missiles and other weapons towards the U.S. to force that chaos, infrastructure collapse, and prevent us from being able to move forces forward. At the same time, because they have that friendship that knows no bounds with Russia, as well as their relationship with North Korea and Iran, that this would become a strategic opportunity for those nations to continue to sow chaos and pursue their own aggressive objectives across the globe. And there would be little that we could do to counter that unless we address the internal components, the strategic deterrence and resilience, and to pursue strategic stability that General Chilton mentioned. So I see this all tied together.
Yeah, let me tell you a funny story. So, when I was a commander in NORAD NORTHCOM, my J2 team, I would talk about China and their bombers being able to reach Alaska or North America and their assets. And they're like, they can't do it. And I'm like, well, you're making an assumption that they're going to deploy from China. I said, what happens if they partner up with Russia? What just happened? They flew Chinese bombers from Eastern Russia.
Yep.
Talk about changing the complex for decision-making for our National Command Authority in the crisis with Chinese bombers on Russian territory or vice versa. The Russians have done that as well. Mm-hmm. We're not in a good place when it comes to having these discussions.
Yeah, and
I agree.
We need to be able to communicate that to the American public so they understand that this is not, 1992. We live in a very different and far more complex global environment.